I want to approach this course, really not from the point of view of I don't know what to say, a literary critic, a psychoanalyst, necessarily a historian, but I want to, sort of focus on the cantos as a monument of art and look particularly at really specific ways that the book is built as a whole. Um, I should say at the outset, since most of you saw the advertisement and it was up on the screen when we joined, of me sitting on top of uh, Pawnee Peak in the Indian Peaks here in Colorado, that was not an arbitrary photograph I put up there. I'm thinking in particular of a, yeah, there it is. Pawnee, and in the background, you can see Mount Hopi, Mount George, and just off to the side, a little shoulder of Mount Shoshone. Um, you can take that down, Paul, but thank you. Uh, that, to my mind, was meant to be a rhyme, Rhyme, or you could say Rime, a rhyme in Ezra Pound's sense, which is to say a sort of coalescence of either images or sounds or historic periods. That picture was meant to be a rhyme to a short poem by Ezra Pound's friend Basil Bunting. His poem is called Written on the Fly Leaf of Ezra Pound's Cantos. And at the end of the poem, after a little bit of wry observations about the cantos, he says, "There they are, the Alps. You'll have to go a long way around if you want to avoid them." And I began, as Paul mentioned, teaching the cantos in the 1990s, because at that point I had the belief that you could be an American poet, artist, writer, and not read the cantos, but you might have to do more work to avoid the cantos than to actually take them on and read them. And that's a spirit I want to move forward with here, that, this is not only a kind of irreducible monument in our North American and world heritage, but it's also an extremely difficult book and really helpful to have a guide through. So I would acknowledge, I think, a man who's long dead named Michael Andre Bernstein, who was my first guide through the cantos. He was a critic at UC Berkeley back in the late 1970s. He wrote a pretty good book on the cantos and, served as a guide for me. And I've now been many times through the book and have managed to, well, I taught it maybe 6 or 8 times for a semester at Naropa University, or back then it was the Naropa Institute. And really with the idea that, in a sense, it is our Alps as a literary, more than a monument, really, more like a natural force out there. Times have changed. I'm not sure that I believe with that fervency anymore that you need to encounter the book. And in fact, I was just talking with a friend today, and he said, yes, in the academic world, Ezra Pound is radioactive. And so right now, I'm not sure there's any university in the world that would be willing to teach Ezra Pound, because he had some pretty difficult politics and at times some pretty loathsome politics. And some of us believe that there were times where he may have been clinically insane. And my view is that rather than using that as an excuse to avoid his book, it's one of the reasons to dive straight in. The obnoxious politics are the politics of the 20th century, which are the forming politics of our own century. There's a lot of economic policy and economic theory and a lot of economic crackpot ideas in the big book. But no matter how crackpot they are, they constantly illuminate the economics that are really, in some sense, governing our world historically and politically right now. Um, and so, a little bit to say that we've got 8 weeks here. This is a gigantic book. There's no way we're going to cover something like 100 pages a week. But I'm also really loath to take the best hits approach. The problem with the best hits approach is that you miss the forest for the trees. There are some magnificent poems in the cantos, individual cantos, and there may be 20 of them, 30 of them that you could lift out and put into best hits of the cantos and have some remarkable poetry and never deal with what makes this such a intensely dynamic and difficult book, really like our Alps or other sorts of, natural features or monuments or something out there. And I think it's best rather than taking the best hits and ignoring goofy economics or loathsome politics or incomprehensible stretches that may seem arid. It's better to take on the whole book and really see it for what it is. So let's see. I want to begin a little bit by saying that I taught the book 6 or 8 times. I've been through it quite a lot. I have often spoken of it as probably that legendary book that I would take to a desert island, not because I like everything in it, not because I even am near to understanding everything in it, but as a handbook for artists. I think it's an astounding wealth of material. I can't think of another single book that, to my mind, has so many important gestures of art of the last 120 years, let's say 110 years. Along with that, there's a sense that I have that you can almost use it as like a divination book in one of those old medieval ways, that you can almost find practically every event of contemporary history by going back into the cantos. And I want to really point out some places where the echoes or the rhymes or the historical overlays that Ezra Pound has managed to surface in his book are completely relevant for us right now. At the same time, one of the things that makes it so hard, so difficult, so impenetrable, so terrifying, and so frustrating is that it really is an enormous book built up of fragments. I don't know when the last time any of you read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland was, but the fourth to last line in Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, Eliot says, "These fragments I have shored against my ruin." And, thinking of that phrase, "these fragments I have shored against my ruins," there was a kind of modernist idea that the world had been really broken apart. And it was up to the artist to, in some senses, salvage what was worth salvaging for a new civilization. And that was the task that Ezra Pound really took on in the cantos, far more than T.S. Eliot ever did. And so one of the challenges of going through the cantos is that it really is built out of fragments. Entire cantos may themselves be a single fragment, and we're going to look at a great deal of that. One more show of hands I'd like to see. How many of you have read some of the cantos? Read a few cantos here or there, okay? How many of you have read all of the cantos at some point? Aha, I see somebody going like this. I can't quite tell if that is, warding off the do you also wear garlic around your neck? I don't know. Diana. Diana. Um, Okay, well, like I said, I have no idea how far we're going to get into the cantos, but what I want to do is at least begin to provide the tools. And I think most of what you may need is there at the, in the early cantos. And once you have sort of some keys about how to work, and I'll also give, various reference books, but you'll be able to make a decision for yourself how far you want to go. Let's see. I see Anne. You have your hand up. You have a question. Anne GW.
And you'll
I,
have to, there you go.
I put my hand up in response to your last question and I don't know how to take it down.
Oh, okay. I think you can go back to the reactions and it'll show you how to
Lower hand. I just found
Yeah.
it.
Great, great. One other question. How many of you have a copy of the Cantos right next to you? Most
I've
people,
ordered mine, but it hasn't come yet.
okay. Can get by with a little bit of listening here then. What I'd like to do is something that makes a lot of sense, which is to begin at the beginning. There are a lot of books that you don't need to begin at the beginning, and there are a lot of books that I think work better if you read them backwards. The Cantos were meant to be a book that not only contained history, but that enacted history and recuperated history as history moved along. They are, in some senses, not very autobiographical, and yet you can't stay away from Pound's own biography, which is embedded but often very hidden in the cantos. And so I think reading from the beginning to the end is really the way to do it, particularly because the early cantos lay out a lot of, you could say, themes in terms of content, a lot of methods in terms of the way the composition operates. And so, that would be really a place to begin. As far as Pound's biography goes, how many of you have a more or less, sort of like an ideogram of what Pound's life looked like? Is there anybody here who does? Few people do. Okay. Um, just as a teaser, I want to drop in that Ezra Pound, for all what looks like a great scholarly monument that he created, um, he led a life that is so close to unbelievable. The way I've often thought of it is if you tried to write like, let's say, a film script based on his life and took it to Hollywood, you'd be laughed out. People would say, nobody'd believe this. This is idiotic. This is just not possible. So he is one of these artists who, through various accidents of his own craziness and accidents of history, ended up leading a life that, first of all, is so uncommon and so strange. So we're going to need to deal with that a little bit, but also becomes part of the method of writing the book. So I am going to dip into his biography in various ways as we move through. But those of you who have the book, why don't we move right to the opening canto on page 3 is what it would be in most editions. Yeah,
May, may,
Paul.
may I share a screen with that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that would be great. If you've got a screen to share, then we can all watch it as it moves forward. And what I'm going to do is read this canto entire. It's about 2.5 pages. So maybe, Paul, you will scroll as needed.
Absolutely.
Great. And then went down to the ship set keel to breakers forth on the godly sea, and we set up mast and sail on that swart ship, bore sheep aboard her, and our bodies also, heavy with weeping, and winds from sternward bore us out onward with bellying canvas. Circe's this craft, the trim coiffed goddess. Then sat we amidships, wind jamming the tiller. Thus with stretched sail, we went over sea till day's end. Sun to his slumber, shadows o'er all the ocean. Came we then to the bounds of deepest water, to the Cimmerian lands, and peopled cities covered with close webbed mist, unpierced ever with glitter of sun rays, nor with stars stretched, nor looking back from heaven. Swartest night stretched over wretched men there. The ocean flowing backward, came we then to the place aforesaid by Circe. Here did they rites, Paramedes and Eurylochus, and drawing sword from my hip, I dug the L-square pipkin. Poured we libations unto each the dead, first mead, and then sweet wine, water mixed with white flour. Then prayed I many a prayer to the sickly death's heads, as set in Ithaca, sterile bulls of the best for sacrifice, heaping the pyre with goods, a sheep to Tiresias only, black, and a bell sheep. Dark blood flowed in the fosse, souls out of Erebus, cadaverous dead, of brides, of youths, and of the old who had borne much, souls stained with recent tears, girls tender, men many, mauled with bronze lance heads, battle spoil, bearing yet dreary arms. These many crowded about me, with shouting, pallor upon me, cried to my men for more beasts, slaughtered the herds, sheep slain of bronze, poured ointment, cried to the gods, to Pluto the strong, and praised Proserpine. Unsheathed the narrow sword, I sat to keep off the impetuous, impotent dead, till I should hear Tiresias. But first Elpenor came, our friend Elpenor, unburied, cast on the wide earth, limbs that we left in the house of Circe, unwept, unwrapped in sepulchre, since toils urged other, pitiful spirit. And I cried in hurried speech, Elpenor, how art thou comest to this dark coast? Camest thou afoot, outstripping seamen? And he in heavy speech, ill fate and abundant wine. I slept in Circe's ingle, going down the long ladder unguarded. I fell against the buttress, shattered the nape nerve. The soul sought Avernus, but thou, O king, I bid remember me, unwept, unburied. Heap up mine arms, be tombed by seaboard and inscribed, a man of no fortune and with a name to come. And set my oar up that I swung mid fellows. And Anticlea came, whom I beat off, and then Tiresias, Theban, holding his golden wand, knew me and spoke first. A second time? Why, man of ill star, facing the sunless dead in this joyless region? Stand from the fosse, leave me my bloody bever for sooth's sake. And I stepped back, and he, strong with the blood, said then, Odysseus, shalt return through spiteful Neptune, over dark seas, lose all companions. And then Anticlea came. Lie quiet, Divus. I mean, that is Andreas Divus in Officina Vecchelli, 1538, out of Homer. And he sailed by Sirens, and thence outward and away and unto Circe, venerandum, and the Cretan's phrase, with the golden crown, Aphrodite, Cupri munimenta sortita est, mirthful, orichalci, with golden girdles and breastbands, thou with dark eyelids, bearing the golden bow of Argacida. So that. Thanks, Paul. So let's see. That's a poem. It does not look terribly modernist or fragmented until you suddenly get to the last page. And all of a sudden, the voice changes and something very, very strange starts to happen. Some of you may know where this came from. Some of you may recognize where it came from. But this is a translation of book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, known as the Nekia, or the Descent to the Dead, or the Visit to the Dead. Most of you probably know the Odyssey, which will factor slightly in the Cantos, but in some models is the model for the Cantos. And it's interesting that Pound, after many false starts for a long poem, decided to begin in the middle of the Odyssey. The situation here, just to say it very quickly, is Odysseus has been imprisoned by the witch Circe on her island. His men have been turned into pigs, and through the intervention of some of the gods who are on his side, his men are restored to their human form, and they are trying to sail back after the Trojan War to get home to Ithaca, where they're from. But Circe tells them that they need first to go consult Tiresias, the soothsayer, the great legendary person who can see the future. How many of you know who Tiresias is? He also shows up in the wasteland. How many of you know why Tiresias has the gift of prophecy? Anybody want to try to tell that little story? We'll just have to go there for a moment. Tiresias had the bad luck or the good luck during his lifetime, which was long, long ago, let's say, to have been a man who was turned for a while into a woman by sorcery and eventually turned back into a man. That's the backstory. Once on Mount Olympus, the great god Zeus and his wife Hera were having an argument over who had more fun in the act of sex. And both were invested in it being the other gender. So Zeus was saying, women have far more fun in sex than men do. And Hera was saying, that's obnoxious. How can you even say it? The men get all the fun. We women are just being used. And it went back and forth. And they didn't know how to decide the dispute because obviously this is subjective. And then Zeus remembered Tiresias, who had lived for a number of years as a woman and therefore had experienced sex from both sides. And so they called Tiresias into audience and said, tell us, who has more fun in sex, a man or a woman? And Tiresias said, well, you've come to the right person. If there are 9 parts of rapture in the sexual act, if there are 10 parts of rapture in the sexual act, 9 go to the woman. And Hera was so furious that she struck him blind on the spot. and stormed out of the council hall. And there was Tiresias, innocently now blinded. And Zeus said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. My wife has a temper. I can't really do anything about your eyesight. But tell you what, in recompense, I will give you foresight. I'll give you the gift of prophecy. I'll give you second sight." So Tiresias is the legendary prophet, the one who can see the future. So this is why Tiresias has appeared, or really why Odysseus has gone to the mouth of the underworld to call up the ghosts or the shades from Hades or Erebus. Diana, question. You need to take your mute off.
So I don't ever remember hearing that about Tiresias ever in any. So did that like get edited out of?
I think it's an Ovid. I think it's an Ovid, and I think you can find it in, great many places there. Yeah.
Well, that's far more entertaining than the version of the myths that I.
Yeah, a lot of those old tales were expurgated for sure. Okay, I want to, those of you who have your book with you, just a couple of things I want to point out very quickly about this as a poem. Notice the very first two words of that first canto. And then, or maybe even the first line, and then went down to the ship. This is an epic that is starting right in the middle of things. It's not a lot of background here. It's just and then, which is a sort of extraordinary spot to find a book that's 800 pages long. And then if you turn to page 5 and look at the last words, two words, so that, colon. Those, I think, are very modernist gestures. We begin in the middle, and when this poem is finished, we not only get a so that catapults us to turn the page, but we also get a colon, as though we're like still in the middle, not only of a narrative, but of a sentence. As for the rest of this translation, that page 5 with the growl when the voice changed, lie quiet, Divus, that is Andreas Divus. The story is that Ezra Pound, as a young man, was on the banks of the Seine in Paris. I don't know if they're still there. All the book stalls that used to be line the banks of the Seine. How many of you saw book stalls when you were in Paris, all along there? It's a great place to spend a day browsing for books, especially if you're multilingual. And Ezra Pound had been browsing the stalls along the banks of the Seine and found a beautiful old translation of the Odyssey into Latin by this guy, Andreas Divus, in 1587. And it was a 2-volume set, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Pound wavered for a few minutes, wondering which volume to buy because he didn't have enough money to buy both. And at some point, he just stuck out his hand, plucked out the Odyssey, paid his money, and went home with it. So this opening canto is a translation not from the Greek, but from a Latin translation of the Greek. And Pound has done a very weird thing with that. He's kind of translated it into the old Anglo-Saxon rhythms. If any of you know the word alliteration, Anglo-Saxon poetry used to not rhyme at the end, but at the beginning. So if you go to, let's maybe take a look, starting with the third line of that canto. We set up mast and sail on that swart ship. set, sail, swart, ship, 4 alliterations there. The next line, bore sheep aboard her and our bodies also, 3 BOs. On and on like that. Circe's this craft, the trim coif goddess. So Pound has translated this into kind of Anglo-Saxon rhythms and Anglo-Saxon rhyming, and then used a few old Anglo-Saxon words like dreary, which means bloody, bever. When Tiresias says, leave me my bever, that's our word that comes up in beverage. It means drink. It's an old Anglo-Saxon word. And, then a few little gestures like I dug the L square pitkin. Pitkin, again, being a sort of old English term. So what we've got here, just as, look at the fragments to begin with, Homer's Odyssey, which theoretically begins the Western tradition of literature, translated into Latin by Andreas Dives, translated by Ezra Pound, not into contemporary English of his time, but into the English language of later than Beowulf, but sort of close to Beowulf, pre-Chaucer in a way. And then when the canto breaks into Pound's own growly voice, you get that sort of lie quiet, which is, maybe we don't say a lot of that now, but I've heard people use it. That's almost contemporary slang, lie quiet. And then, that is Andreas Dives, and then a quote from what must be the colophon of his book, In Officina Vecellii 1538, and then breaking off from that fragment of the colophon out of Homer, and then back into our narrative, and he sailed by sirens and thence outward and away and unto Circe, and then suddenly a Homeric hymn, Venerandum, in the Cretan's phrase, with the golden crown, Aphrodite. Who's Aphrodite?
She was born from the foamy remainders of Kronos's, testicles once they were ripped from him by Zeus in a paternalistic squabble. She's the goddess of love.
Goddess of love, yeah.
For some reason, after all that.
Yeah, good. So Aphrodite, and then we have a little phrase, cupri monumenta sortita est, hold sway over the heights or over all the heights of Cyprus, from an old prayer in Latin. Then we jump back to English, mirthful, but by now, mirthful doesn't even sound like an English word. Then we jump back into a Latin word, orichalci, and then back to English with golden girdles and breastbands, thou with dark lids bearing the bow of Argacida. So that. Very quickly, what would Argacida mean? Anybody have any idea?
Isn't Argus a Greek thing?
Yeah, Argos, sure. And that's where the Greeks came from to destroy Troy, basically. Yeah. And you've heard of the Argonauts, Jason and the Argonauts. Yeah, How about the Sida part? Everybody's heard of homicide, suicide, regicide.
So that
Argacida.
makes it kind of like modernizes it by putting that suffix on the end of it.
Yeah, it may very well be a coinage by Ezra Pound. This is going to change very fast, but I think what you could say is if Argacida means killer of Greeks, right at the moment, it's as though Ezra Pound is saying the whole Trojan War and all the death and destruction happened because of love gone awry. It's Aphrodite. Sounds very Freudian in a way. Love gone bad, channeled off into aggression and hatred, and all those people who aren't, getting sex the right way decide to build, weapons and go conquer territory. It's very Freudian in a way, even though Ezra Pound probably never read Freud and wouldn't have liked him if he had, but it might have been something in the air, you could say.
I was
Andrew-
reading that, yeah, I was reading though that he really likes to make up words.
Yeah, he certainly does, the neologisms. Paul,
Excuse
you
me,
said,
Andrew. You need to turn on a light. You're going into the dark.
oh, good, I'll do that. I've got it set up here.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Amy. Thank you.
You're welcome, Paul.
Good, thank you. I had it, yeah, thank you.
But Andrew, does Argosita also refer to Jason and Medea's murder of the son, or is it a larger context that
Well, I think here, if you know your Odyssey at all, Aphrodite sided with the Trojans in the war. So she's certainly the one responsible for killing the Greeks. She was certainly the one back there saying, wait a minute. Helen and Paris have a wonderful relationship. Don't send her back just because this warlord named Menelaus wants his wife back. And so in some senses, by siding with the Trojans, she was responsible for the, war. So in a way, she is a killer of Greeks.
Thank you.
Great. Well, what a weird place to begin a long poem, right? A multiple translation from the Odyssey that seems to be, sort of dealing with like these old mythologies. So now what I want to do a bit is to back up and give a really brief synopsis of what brought Ezra Pound to this point. And I think not a bad idea to do a little bit of bio here. Basically, Ezra Pound bio, and I'm going to do it very thumbnail sketch. And some of it I'm going to have probably be a little out of touch with exact dates and exact, certain details of it. But I think it's good to see a little bit of his life. Okay, so Ezra Pound was born 1985. What was in a little town called Haley, Idaho. It's in southern Idaho. What was going on in 1885? Hugh Kenner says a wonderful thing in a book he wrote on Ezra Pound that in 1885, in Europe, Richard Wagner had been dead for 4 years. In the American West, Jesse James had been dead for 2 years. That's a nice little ideogram there. What's Europe like? What's the American West like? Ezra Pound was buried in basically Jesse James territory. His father was his father worked in an assay office, which is to say where miners bring in the ore that they've found and get it weighed and get paid in cash for gold or silver that they brought in. Ezra Pound claims that he was born on a table in the back room of a bar and weaned on kerosene, and that's what gave him red hair and a red beard. He was a great liar, a great mythographer himself. But either way, to know that when he was born, Emily Dickinson still had a year to live, and Walt Whitman still had about 7 years to live. So if you want to put him in history, Dickinson's just about dead. Walt Whitman's in his dotage. And there are no other poets in America that I think anybody really much reads anymore. I mean, unless anybody loves Edwin Arlington Robinson or, Longfellow or John Greenleaf Whittier. I just don't think that, it was a fairly moribund time for poetry with the death of Dickinson and Whitman. Ezra Pound's parents, Homer and Isabel, moved fairly quickly to Philadelphia, where Homer, his father, got a job in the Philadelphia Mint. And before long, they moved out into what you'd call the suburbs now, but this was about 1889. So the suburbs were not built for automobiles, obviously. They were just like little townships outside of the city. Probably a somewhat unremarkable boyhood, but In 1901, at the age of 16, Pound went to the University of Pennsylvania. Um, and he began to study Romance languages and literature. And he did something rather remarkable for somebody who's still a teenager. He decided that he wanted to know more about poetry than any other person alive. And, this is a very hubristic or arrogant, um, you know, vow or dedication of himself. But he had on his side a saying that goes way back to antiquity, which is that inspiration is from God, but technique is for man to learn. Inspiration is from God, but technique is for man to learn. So he set about really, working on technique for himself. At Penn, he got to be known a little bit for dandyism. There are accounts of in the school paper of Ezra Pound wearing lime green pants, pink jackets, wearing a gold earring. I mean, this is, rather progressive for 1901. He carried a cane, interestingly. But maybe the most important thing that he did is he picked up a buddy of his who was a, sort of guy who was working his way into English from Spanish, a guy who'd his mother was Puerto Rican and his first language was Spanish, and was working towards being a poet also. This is a guy named William Carlos Williams, had gone to the same school. Really rather remarkable that, these two young pillars of modernism ended up at the same school. For a little while, Pound went off to a place called Hamilton College, dug into Romance language and literature, studied Anglo-Saxon, and heard a chance remark by a professor of his, something to do with, can you imagine what it would be like to spend 40 years working on a poem? This professor of his was named Ibbotson and was a scholar of English. And Pound sort of tucked that away. What would it be like to spend 40 years working on a poem? Once he graduated from Hamilton, he went back to Penn to do graduate work. And Williams was there in medical school. And Williams and Pound formed a little gang with a third remarkable poet of modernism, Hilda Doolittle, later to be known as HD. So the three of them became sort of inseparable poetry pals. Pound did not get along very well with his professors. He did manage to get a master's. He had what seems like an early affair with HD, proposed marriage to her, but HD's father, who was a respectable Moravian from Philadelphia and also a college professor, threw the young Ezra out of the house and told him never to return. So that ended both the affair and the marriage proposal. Pound seems then to have quickly met another renowned modernist, Marianne Moore, and probably proposed marriage to her too. That went nowhere. But he got a job then at a little town in Western Indiana called Crawfordsville. It was a little Presbyterian college, and Pound went out there to Wabash College and quickly developed a reputation in this very conservative, Bible-oriented school for being a bit of a rebel. Evidently, the school newspaper reported that Mr. Ezra Pound was known to put brandy in his afternoon tea and that sort of thing. He left Wabash under pretty scandalous circumstances. His story, which is the one worth telling, is that he stayed up late one night writing letters, and he was in a rooming house that was run by two elderly women, and he had a room in which he stayed. He wrote letters deep into the night, put stamps on them, and decided to go out to the mailbox. And he went out onto the street, walked down to the mailbox, and it was snowing and windy and cold. And he met a young girl with very little clothing on. She was a vaudeville actress, and the troupe had somehow pulled out of town without her. So she had no money, was hungry, was cold, no real clothes. So he brought her back to his room, tucked her into his bed, slept on the floor, got up early to go off to teach his class in the morning. And when the elderly women came up to make his bed in the morning, they found a young vaudeville actress in his bed and immediately blew the whistle on him. The Wabash College instantly fired him. And then as things began to calm down and he began to tell his side of the story, if there was even another side of the story, they eventually grumblingly offered to reinstate him. But by then, Pound realized, this ain't for me. This is not the college for me. This is not the life I want. So he basically took a little severance pay, told them to shove everything else, and he went back to the East Coast and took his severance pay and turned it into a ticket to Europe. And he sailed first to Gibraltar. When he left the wars of New York, only one person saw him off. That was Marianne Moore. And Pound ended up first in Venice. That was his first real stop, April of 1908. And he had a plan to go to London. And one of the things he wanted to do in London was to meet a poet 20 years older than him, William Butler Yeats, who he had determined was the finest practicing poet. But before Pound went to London, he wanted to have a book. So in Venice, because of the difference in economy, the American dollar went a long way, and he had a little bit of money left over, and he published a book of his own poetry, early poetry, real juvenilia. I don't think many people read his early poetry, but some of it's quite good in a kind of pre-Raphaelite way. If you like to read Dante Gabriel Rossetti or Alfred Lord Tennyson or people like that, you might really like some of this early poetry of Ezra Pound. It's very romantic. So he put together a book with a very fin de siècle title, Lume Spento, which means like the tapers spent or the candles burned down. It's sort of like an old man's title for a guy who was, in his early 20s. But, that was sort of the mood of fin de siècle Europe at that point. Once Pound got his book in hand, he went off to London and very quickly thought of London as something of a backwater. It was not nearly as dynamic as the American cities he'd seen, but he thought it was a perfect place to start a renaissance. And he spent a bunch of years there, relatively poor. He had fairly quickly broken into a little circle that included William Butler Yeats and William Butler Yeats's lover, a woman named Olivia Shakespeare. Olivia Shakespeare, in a distant part of London, held a salon, and Ezra Pound liked to go to the salon. And the report seemed to be that he would walk there, and he liked the salon for the people that were there, but he particularly liked it for the biscuits and tea because it was his only meal of the day. He had no way of making money. He had a little flat, and he began to spend time with Yeats. He began to write for local journals. And he figured out a really good, this is an era where people actually made money writing reviews. And Ezra Pound found a really good gig or like now we'd call it a hoax or a scam or something. But he would get a job. He could write on anything. He could write on a book of poetry. He could write on a novel. He could write on music. He could write on art. But he would publish a review, and then immediately he would send in from another name a scathing attack on that review. And then he would write back as Ezra Pound, and he would whip up these great controversies in the journals of his day. And it, kept him in, enough money to sort of support himself. His friend HD sailed over, and he and she and a man who became her husband cooked up the tenets of what became Imagism, which they pulled mostly from HD's poetry. In fact, Ezra Pound, by working his way through different magazines, had contacted Poetry Chicago in Chicago and become something of a foreign editor for them. And he sent them a group of poems by Hilda Doolittle, but Hilda never liked her own name. So Pound, before sending off the poems, cut off her name, Hilda Doolittle, and signed in a flourish HD Imagiste at the bottom. Nobody'd ever heard of Imagism, but there it was, and Imagism suddenly became a thing. Anne, I see you have your hand up.
I have a question about that, because wasn't William Carlos Williams also influenced by the Imagism, but he was back in the States. So how did that work?
Well, very quickly, Imagism became a big deal in the United States, especially around progressive poets.
Because of Ezra Pound?
Pound and HD and Richard Aldington, the three of them signed their manifestos together.
Okay.
Richard Aldington was now by now married to HD, and Williams may not have needed, the Imagist manifesto. He may have been coming to it on his own, but it was all really about unshackling from the tenets of the past. Well, let's see. A bunch of other people began to appear. Pound had many good friends, including, I want to mention, a figure named Henri Gautier-Brejka. If any of you can see this little icon of New Directions, it has appeared on so many New Directions books. This was drawn by Henri Gautier-Brejka, who was a Romanian sculptor who was living in London, probably Ezra Pound's best friend. Various other people, a novelist named Wyndham Lewis, a woman from Boston named Amy Lowell, who, as soon as she heard about Imagism, said, "That's for me," and sailed to London. There was a whole gang of, writers, artists, musicians, all sorts of people. And Pound had really established, what he had hoped to do, which was a kind of renaissance of the arts. With Imagism, poetry had changed. There was word from the continent of symbolism was old. Now it was things like Dadaism. There were all sorts of exciting movements, these early years of the teens, 19 teens. And Ezra Pound found himself at the center of it all. He moved on beyond what he called Imagism to another school he sort of found called Vorticism. And maybe the most important thing that happened to him was he came into some notebooks of classical Chinese poetry. These were by a Bostonian named Ernest Fenollosa, who had died early, abruptly. And Fenollosa's wife had been in correspondence with Pound about it, and she brought Fenollosa's notebooks to London and handed them over to Ezra Pound and said, "I think you're the guy to do something with this." And about the same time she handed over the notebooks, something really big happened, and this changed the world. World War I broke out, and Europe exploded, and it exploded miserably. It was like that, there had been a sense of European, like, let's say, hubris, that believed Europe was the highest point of human endeavor, that European arts were the highest point of human endeavor. And all of a sudden, Europe was ripping itself apart with weaponry that had never been seen before. Mustard gas, zeppelins, machine guns. And very quickly, most of Ezra Pound's friends were drafted into one army or another. Ezra Pound was not drafted because the US had not moved into the war yet. But Gaudier Brejka went to the trenches. Wyndham Lewis went to the trenches. And Pound saw warfare break out and destroy this artistic renaissance. And he published an extraordinarily important book, a little book that was originally 13 translations from the Chinese called Cathay, which were translations from the Fenollosa notebooks. They were later, a little bit later, they were expanded a bit. How many of you have read some of Cathay? Anybody have read the poems of Cathay? It's a sort of a brilliant book. I think it does a couple of things. First of all, the power of Pound's translations showed, I think, anybody who was reading poetry that Europe wasn't the pinnacle, that actually Tang Dynasty China had written poems as good as anybody had ever written. And these were also cast in a very modern language. There was also a subtle way in which I think this was a very strategic anti-war book. He selected poems that were in, I think, 3 voices. The voices were young conscripts in China, out at the edge of the empire, holding the battle lines against some sort of barbarian forces. These were kids who were too young to know what they were doing. They were homesick. They knew they might die any day, and they had no idea what war was about. And Pound found these poems in Tang Dynasty China. The second voice he had was young women back in the capital who had no lovers because the young men were all off at war. And the third voice were elderly, scholarly people who had been brushed aside, who had some wisdom, but who were not being listened to by the sort of warmongering, money-making period. And so I think it's a very, very skillful book. So that, sort of landed and established Ezra Pound as a poet, in this completely new mode. But his Renaissance is gone. His friend Gaudier Brejka died in the trenches. The story that Pound tells is that Gaudier Brejka, the last piece of sculpture he made was he picked up a rifle off of a dead German soldier and knocked off the butt and carved a sculpture out of it in the trenches, and then died shortly after that. Pound's friend Wyndham Lewis ended up in the hospital. Pound's friend Hulme, who helped develop Imagism, ended up in the hospital where he, as Pound says later, incurred the displeasure of the medics because he was reading Kant in the original. The Germans were the enemy. And so here was a guy reading German. But Pound found things really just finished in London. In one last desperate effort to keep his Renaissance going, he went to a publishing house and suggested, I know more about poetry than anybody. Let's do a new anthology to replace Palgrave's golden anthology of poetry and bring it up to date. And he was told by the publishers, do you have any idea how much money we have invested in those plates? a new anthology is out of the question. And Pound suddenly realized poetry wasn't about aesthetics in this world, it was about money. And he claims that at that point he quit the shores of that barbarian island and sailed to Paris. The war was over, but there were dead and wounded everywhere, and monuments blasted. And in some sense, Pound had lost his renaissance. Europe had lost its complacency. Everybody had lost relatives or villages. And it's out of this ruin that Ezra Pound decides Western civilization is done. A new civilization has to occur. And he pictured himself as Odysseus trying to sail home and find a new place. And that, I think, is why he begins his cantos, with this sort of visit to the dead and a visit to the prophet to find where to go and to get word of what the future will be. And to pick up the fragments that he knew about from T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, these ruins these fragments I have shored against my ruins. Any thoughts or questions anybody want to interrupt with? Or interject here? Or
I do
I
have
just
one.
had-
Oh,
Oh,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Well, I just had to go pay my grandsons for the gardening, so you might have already said that, but he would, I mean, the Wasteland would be a completely different document if it weren't for Ezra Pound, a completely different poem. So he was really involved in the writing of that.
yeah, he was very close to T.S. Eliot, and T.S. Eliot brought him a bunch of pages and said, I don't know what to do with this. And Ezra Pound said, there's some really good writing here, but you're not modern. And we know now that Ezra Pound cut up what was the original poem of T.S. Eliot's and pasted it back together, and that's The Wasteland as we know. The poet Ron Silliman said it really beautifully. The writing is T.S. Eliot's, the architecture is Ezra Pound's. So Pound was already onto, this idea of how to build a poem in pieces and fragments and non-narrative.
Andrew, do you remember the title of The Wasteland before Ezra made his suggestion?
I do. Do you remember it, Paul?
I pulled it up out of Ed Sanders. Eliot to Paris, page 223 of America History and Verse, came to Paris November 21 and showed Ezra Pound a long poem with the ghastly title, He Do the Police in Different Voices.
Mhm.
Yeah, that kind of shows where T.S. Eliot was. He was straight out of St. Louis. It was probably sort of a minstrelsy title. He do the police in different voices. And Ezra Pound cut it apart and rebuilt that thing. And of course, The Wasteland became like the most famous poem of its era, of its moment, but of its era, certainly. Let's see, Carla, yeah, you have a question.
Yeah, I'm just curious, as you mentioned that Pound at this point in time was thinking the world needs to be rebuilt, and the Russian Revolution was also happening at that point in time, and I'm wondering what, if any, kind of influence that had on him.
We'll see that as we get into the cantos. There's a very important passage that we'll get to in not too long of the Russian Revolution. I think it's clear that he had read some of the revolutionary material, and it was clear that he knew about the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Revolution, really. I don't know that he knew much about, the sort of internecine disputes among the different revolutionary groups, but to him, it was really right on his radar in a way. And he probably had met John Reed, who was an American who had, wrote a sort of consequential book at the time that was like a witness to the revolutionary days in Russia. And so we'll see some material of that, and we'll see Pound in the cantos arguing with Stalin, referencing Lenin. So he was aware of it, but maybe not at this time. There may not have been much news in the sort of, little period between the end of World War I and, let's say, 1921, when The Wasteland is published. There may not have been a lot of clear information coming out of Russia in those 4 years.
Okay.
Roxy, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Well, having taken a course on The Wasteland fairly recently with Brenda Hillman and Robert Haas, we looked at some of the original that was cut out by Pound. I found myself feeling kind of super irritated with that gesture of just cutting, but now, because loving Silliman as I do, the kind of the reclamation or the kind of reparation or whatever of building an architecture that is as beautiful as it is interesting to me. And it does have more music, and it does seem to cohere with his ideas about vorticism and imagism. A poem, one image can have a vortex of many different ideas, but why doesn't he practice what he preaches? Because he seems to me like to be an inveterate old, control freak with other people's work. I mean, if he's like HD imagiste, he's renaming people and he's kind of cutting them down, but maybe he's improving them. It's just that he didn't really cut himself down with the Cantos, ironically. I don't know. I'm probably...
Yeah, I think that's a good observation.
Yeah.
Also, at the time that The Wasteland was published, 1921, Eliot became very famous. HD was pretty well known. Pound himself had not really accomplished very much. He did not have that kind of reputation. And there seems to have been a little bit of insecurity on his part, that his friends were really accomplishing something and he was kind of stuck with a bunch of old verse forms. So he was not, I would say almost like what he did with The Wasteland, what he did with HD. It was controlling, but it was also him learning how to do something he hadn't yet done with his own work. Also, to note that there's a control freak side, but there's also the side where he was incredibly generous to his friends. He really helped establish Robert Frost's career. He spent his whole life trying to get money for James Joyce. He helped, launch HD's career, Marianne Moore's career, to the extent that they had it. And once he was convinced of T.S. Eliot's brilliance, he tried to raise a fund to support T.S. Eliot because Eliot was working in a bank and he thought this is going to kill the guy's poetry. And he raised money not for himself, but to support T.S. Eliot. And T.S. Eliot, like in a very prescient move, recognized that money doesn't come without strings. And he said, thank you, no, I think I'll just keep my work at the bank and do my thing. But, Pound really, really tried to work with supporting people. And I think there was a lot of hubris there, but he didn't really begin his own work until, he spent about 5 years trying to start the cantos. Yeah, Lauren.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I was really struck by how young he was. He was such a young man. And yeah, I found it quite moving when you described him as sort of seeing himself as this Odysseus, and after the war and the loss of his friends. Yeah, so I think that's the side of him that I'm resonating most with from what you're saying, is just that youth and that kind of, he's passionately pursuing something, which is what young people ideally can do. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say about that.
There's a great anecdote of him during the war. He and William Butler Yeats rented a house together on the west coast of England, and Yeats would read and tell ghost stories, and Ezra Pound would study these Japanese no plays, and they would read their poetry to each other. And then Pound would also go into London and visit a guy. I don't know if anybody reads Ford Madox Ford much anymore, but Ford Madox Ford was a novelist of that sort of fin de siècle British era, older man, big man, apparently, like a large man, and an editor of a literary review in London. And the story is that at some point, Ezra Pound went in to show some of his work to Ford Madox Ford. And this great big man looked at Ezra Pound's poems and got up from his chair and did a somersault on the floor. It's like a Zen teacher. Basically, Ezra Pound got it. I'm this young man and I'm trying to do somersaults, like a big man doing somersaults in a little room. I can't do this kind of poetry. And that apparently was his great teaching. What you're trying to do is like somersaults. Get real, young man. Do something for your generation. Don't write like the old people.
Lovely.
He went back to, he went back to Stone Cottage, they called it, where he was serving as Yeats's secretary. And the two men, the older Irish poet and the young American, would wander along the cliffs, taking walks. And at some point, they were picked up by some MPs, British MPs, who were incredibly skeptical of foreigners because a war was on, and especially the Irish, because since Ireland was a British colony at the time, there was a lot of fear that Ireland would side with Germany, and the MPs thought maybe Yeats and Pound were, foreign agents trying to signal to German boats that would land an invading troop on the coastline. So they were, basically expelled from the coastline there. So they had, they had a little bit of taste of what was going on with the larger politics. Yes, Diana.
Sorry, I was looking for the little thingy and so I just stuck my hand up. I found a great article in the New York Times from 1988 written by James Longenbach. And he called it The Odd Couple, Pound and Yeats Together. And it's a discourse on what it meant that they spent that time together, and what an incredible, what a rich time it was for both of them for very different reasons.
Yeah, extremely rich, and we'll probably circle back to it at some point. And Longenbach then wrote a book on the time they spent together at what was called Stone Cottage. Just a year really, but close contact in which Yeats modernized his poetry, and Pound got a lot of direct contact with ghost tales and mysticism, and a lot of the approaches that begins to come into the cantos at places. Well, let's do a quick read of Canto 2 here. It's a longer one, but I think it's a good place to pick up from and start to see what really the cantos are about. Much more, the first one sets the tone. Canto 2, if you've got the book, it's page 6. And I'm going to read, but also stop a little bit to make some comments. We know that Ezra Pound was trying to figure out how to do a long poem, and what was hanging over everybody for long poems was the British poet Robert Browning, who was dead, had been dead for some time. But you could say this is a little bit, it opens with great American slang. This is very, very different language. And it's Ezra Pound arguing with the last guy who he thought had written an epic. Hang it all, Robert Browning. There can be but the one Sordello. But Sordello and my Sordello, lo Sordel si fo di Mantovana. Sordello was the name of a medieval French troubadour who Pound thought had revived the lost art of lyric poetry. And Robert Browning wrote along long poem, sort of an epic poem called Sordello. So this is Pound jumping in almost immediately, wondering how he can write his own poem. Hang it all, Robert Browning, there can be but the one Sordello, but Sordello and my Sordello. And then he grabs from the biography of Sordello, a medieval biography, Lo Sordelsi di Mantovana. The Sordellos are from Mantovana. And then suddenly, how did we get to this? So shoe churned in the sea. Seal sports on the spray whited circles of cliff wash. Sleek head, daughter of Lear, eyes of Picasso, under black fur hood, lithe daughter of ocean, and the wave runs in the beach groove, Eleanor, Elenaus, Eleptolus, and poor old Homer blind, blind as a bat, ear, ear for the sea surge, murmur of old men's voices. Let her go back to the ships, back among Grecian faces, lest evil come on our own, evil and further evil, and a curse cursed on our children. Moves, yes, she moves like a goddess and has the face of a god and the voice of Shuni's daughters, and doom goes with her in walking. Let her go back to the ships, back among Grecian voices. And by the beach run, Tyro, twisted arms of the sea god, lithe sinews of water, gripping her, cross-hold, and the blue-gray glass of the wave tense them, glaze azure of water, cold welter, close cover. So where are we here? Let's see what we've done. Go back to the top of the page, Paul. What have we done? We started out with a good old American slang. Sounds kind of antiquated now, but I think in Pound's day, you might have said this. Sounds like something my grandfather would have said. Hang it all, Robert Browning. A little move into questioning Browning's poem Sordello, and then suddenly we jump to this seaside image, Soshu churned in the sea. Anybody know who Soshu is? Soshu is
A deity from the Sen, from ancient Chinese.
Old Chinese, an old Chinese figure churned in the sea. So we suddenly jump to China, and then suddenly back somewhere, seal sports in the spray whited circles of cliff wash. Listen to those two lines. So shoe churned in the sea, seal sports in the spray whited circles of cliff wash. There's a little bit of a stitching back to the first canto in the alliteration there. But then something else is going to happen very quickly. Sleek head, there's our seal, daughter of Lear, the old Celtic sea god. Eyes of Picasso, now we're right up to date. Well, in 1920, when Pound is writing this, under black fur hood, lithe daughter of ocean, and the wave runs in the beach groove. And then suddenly we're going to have a pun that came out of Aeschylus, right after Homer. Eleanor, Elenaus, and Eleptolus. This is one of the things that frustrates people about the cantos is you got to read all these languages, including other scripts. So here's the old Greek, even with the diacritical marks. Eleanor, or in ancient Greece, Elena, or Helen, Helen of Troy, who the war was about. And Aeschylus, at one point, has one of his characters make this pun. Eleanor, and Ella means killer. Remember, we had the Argosida, the killer of Greeks. We've got Eleanor, Elenaus. Naus is our word nautical or boat, destroyer of ships, and Eleptolus, destroyer of cities. So here, Helen is seen as destroyer of the Greek fleet and destroyer of the city of Troy. And poor old Homer, this I think is now Pound's very disembodied voice coming back. And poor old Homer, blind, blind as a bat, ear, ear for the sea surge, murmur of old men's voices. And these old men are the old men of Troy who tried to send Helen back because they knew it was bad juju to steal a warlord's girlfriend and take her off to Troy. Let her go back to the ships. This is the old men. Let her go back to the ships, back among Grecian faces, lest evil come on our own, evil and further evil, and a curse cursed on our children. Moves, yes, she moves like a goddess and has the face of a god and the voice of Shuni's daughters, and doom goes with her in walking. Let her go back to the ships, back among Grecian voices. And then suddenly we come back out onto the sea, and by the beach run, Tyro, twisted arms of the sea god, lithe sinews of water gripping her, cross-hold in the blue-gray glass of the wave tense them, glaze azure of water, cold welter, close cover, quiet, sun-tawny sand stretch, the gulls broad out their wings, nipping between the splay feathers. Snipe come for their bath, bend out their wing joints, spread wet wings to the sun film. This right here is Pound being an imagist. This is good imagism as anybody did. Snipe come for their bath, bend out their wing joints, spread wet wings to the sun film. Let's see, we are at 5:32. Everybody up for 5 more minutes? We've got an important element coming up here. Notice the snipe come up for their bath, bend out their wing joints, spread wet wings to the sun film, comma, I'm going to point out that comma, and by Skyos, to left of the Naxos passage. This is going to be now an episode straight out of Ovid, and this is going to be important. Naviform rock overgrown, algae cling to its edge. There was a wine red glow in the shallows, a tin flash in the sun dazzle. The ship landed in Skyos, men wanting spring water. This is no Odysseus. This is a tale straight out of Ovid. The ship landed in Skyos, men wanting spring water. And by the rock pool, a young boy, loggy with vine must. To Naxos? Yes, we'll take you to Naxos. Come along, lad. Not that way. Aye, that way is Naxos. And I said, it's a straight ship. And an ex-convict out of Italy knocked me into the 4 stays. He was wanted for manslaughter in Tuscany, and the whole 20 against me, mad for a little slave money. And they took her out of Skyos, an offer course. And the boy came to, again, with a racket, and looked out over the bows and to eastward, and to the Naxos passage. God slate then, God slate. Ships stock fast and sea swirl, ivy upon the oars, King Pentheus, grapes with no seed but sea foam, ivy and scupper hole. I, Achates, stood there, and the gods stood by me, water cutting under the keel. Sea break from stern forwards, wake running off from the bow. And where was gunwale, there now is vine trunk, and tenthril where cordage had been. Grape leaves on the rowlocks, heavy vine on the oar shafts, and out of nothing, a breathing, hot breath on my ankles, beasts like shadows in glass, a furred tail upon nothingness. Lynx purr and heathery smell of beasts where tar smell had been. Sniff and pad foot of beasts, eye glitter out of black air. The sky overshot, dry with no tempest, sniff and pad foot of beasts, fur brushing my knee skin, rustle of airy sheaths, dry forms in the ether. And the ship like a keel in shipyard, slung like an ox in smith's sling, ribs stuck fast in the ways, grape cluster over pin rack, void air taking pelt. Lifeless air becomes sinewed, feline leisure of panthers, leopards sniffing the grape shoots by scupper hole, crouched panthers by forehatch, and the sea blue deep about us, green ruddy in shadows, and Liaeus, from now, Archetes, my altars, fearing no bondage, fearing no cat of the woods, safe with my lynxes, feeding grapes to my leopards. A libinum is my incense. The vines grow in my homage. The black swell now smooth in the rudder chains, black snout of a porpoise where lycabs had been, fish scales on the oarsmen. And I worship. I've seen what I have seen. When they brought the boy, I said, he has a God in him, though I do not know which God, and they kicked me into the 4 stays. I have seen what I have seen, Medon's face like the face of a dory, arms shrunk into fins, and you, Pentheus, had as well listened to Tiresias and to Cadmus, or your luck will go out of you. Fish scales over groin muscles, lynx purr amid sea, and of a later year, pale in the wine red algae, if you will lean over the rock, the coral face under wave tinge, rose paleness under water shift, Eleutheria, fair Daphne of seaboards, the swimmer's arms turned to branches. Who will say in what ear, fleeing what band of tritons, the smooth brows, seen and half seen, now ivory stillness. This is the next important book, Ovid's Metamorphosis. It's going to be the method. You can pick up what happened here. This boy, who is the
Yeah.
guy Dionysius, is pulled on board by some men. But even if you don't know the stories, it's so dramatic. Seeing these seamen turn into porpoises and fish in front of your eyes, the cats, the felines coming onto the boat, the tendrils of the grapevines cluttering around the ship, and these poor stupid men who thought they could kidnap a boy and sell him on the slave market, and the boy turns out to be Dionysus and transforms them all.
Was I just imagining, sort of hidden in the language there, a certain post-war consciousness, the kinds of the different forms of death and change and decay and transformation and stuff. He's speaking about it in sort of mythological terms, but I also sort of feel that this is somebody who just witnessed a war, like a young man who just witnessed a war. Am I just reading that into it?
No, I think that is probably very well there. It's certainly like traumatic.
Yeah, it's
You know,
traumatic.
from the point of view of composition, though, I think Pound is trying to introduce the idea that things may not be what they seem, they change into other things.
And it's not what the old men say they are.
They're not what the old men say they are.
When that's where I get that post-war consciousness, because it was the old men that took them into the war.
Yeah. And I think Pound has maybe made an abrupt shift that the source of evil is not love, which we ended the last canto with, but it might be being mad for money.
Mm.
I think this is the first moment that he's introduced something that begins to show that, bad behavior can be tied to money. Well, let's finish off just this last little bit here. We're going to now continue to move. The descriptions are beautifully imagistic, but it's going to be more and more collage and returning. And Soshu churned in the sea. Soshu also using the long moon for a churn stick, lithe turning of water, sinews of Poseidon. Notice the repetitions from the beginning of this canto. Soshu churned in the sea, lithe sinews, and then black azure and hyaline, glass wave over Tyro, close cover, unstillness, bright welter of wave chords, then quiet water, quiet in the buff sands, seafowl stretching wing joints, splashing in rock hollows and sand hollows, in the wave runs by the half dune, glass glint of wave and the tide rips against sunlight, pallor of Hesperus, gray peak of the wave, wave color of grapes pulp, olive gray in the near, far smoke gray of the rock slide, salmon pink wings of the fishhawk, cast gray shadows in water, the tower like a one-eyed great goose cranes up out of the olive grove. And we have heard the fawns chiding Proteus in the smell of hay under olive trees, and the frogs singing against the fawns in the half-light. And damn it, he does it again. He leaves it and. You got to go on Canto 3. He can't leave you. I mean, it really is very interesting. These are not just fragments, but it's fragments that are pulling you forward. And, I think in a sense, what Roxy, you were just saying about, the trauma of World War I, in a funny way, he's there sitting by the seashore, trying to write beautiful poetry about what he sees in the waves, and erupting up out of it is not just mythology, but is, slavery and, great struggles for power and, that extraordinary description. I mean, I've read this 50 times and it still chills me when those sailors start to take on scales. The beasts come like out of glass and you can't see them, but you can smell them and feel their feet on the deck of the ship. And the boy Dionysus is transforming the criminals. And it's all in the words of the ship's captain, this guy Alcetes, who, tried to say, no, you can't have the boy. I run a straight ship. And they punched him and knocked him into the forestays. And there's so much language that is modern American. He was wanted for manslaughter in Tuscany. They knocked me into the forestays. So it's like Pound's mixing contemporary kind of slangy language with Ovid's tales of transformations, with the trauma of World War II, the old men toothlessly speaking and not even being able to see anything. And, you've got Homer, you've got Aeschylus, you've got Ovid, you've got Pound sitting on the shoreline, you've got Soshu from China churning in the waves, and we're just creating this, it's, for readers, this is really, really hard. If this were done with cut-ups from magazines as pictorial, I don't think anybody would have had that hard a time with it. Kurt Schwitters was doing this right at the same time. Kurt Schwitters was doing this in the visual arts. But in the literary arts, people wanted a narrative and this kind of thing. And Pound began to write his friends and say, I'm writing more cantos. Each one is more incomprehensible than the last. It was like he was going to hell on his own bucket.
Yeah, and I notice all the kenning that's happening in this this particular canto. So we're getting all that Anglo-Saxon kind of ancient types of metaphor that also harkens to the content of Ovid and the things kind of melding together, but without all of the verbal apparatus to
Yeah,
pull it together.
yeah. And so much of that, what you're calling the kenning or that alliteration or alliteration, but also the, sort of naming, like see the color of grape pulp or, grape gray in the waves, those kind of little formulas, those are coming straight out of really, poems like The Seafarer and these old Anglo-Saxon. But, you get the feeling that one thing that Pound is trying to do in these early cantos is figure out what he's up to. Figure out what he's up to. How many languages can he get away with? How much can he put in there? He's listening to the avant-garde music of the day. He's looking at the art of the day. And aside from T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which he had sort of built, nobody is cutting pieces up like this. But I don't want to say it's collage because Pound is really working towards a definition of what he's going to call the ideogram method of composition, which is not as sort of, let's say, improvisational and impulsive as the term collage suggests. He's really trying to lay historical periods and lay texts on top of each other to come to a larger meaning. So when Roxy is saying, I feel behind this text, the trauma of World War I, Pound is starting to get us there without even having to name World War I. It's like, this has happened many times. And if we want to take one quick clue from Ovid, it's that not only do things turn into other things, but time periods turn into other periods.
I think I give credit to someone else for saying that, maybe Anne, but I'm fixated on the sounds, right? So the melopea that he writes about in the ABCs of reading, but I'm just fascinated with ship stock fast and sea swirl and grape cluster over pen rack. And to build off of what Matt was saying, I don't know if this is his fascination with Anglo-Saxon sounds exactly, but it's not what it maybe it's like a vortex. Image plus sound equals something bigger. Ideas, history, but sound is a huge part of it. That's what I'm in love with. It means to just burst right in, Carla, excuse me.
Well, let me
No problem
just
at all.
respond to that by saying that every time I read parts of the cantos and I don't know what's going on, if you just go back to the sound, the music is extraordinary. You can read pages and pages without the slightest idea what's going on, and the music is extraordinary. Carla, I think you had your hand up.
I just, when you first started talking about Pound, you were saying that in his very early 20s, that he had this hubris about becoming the poet who knew the most about poetry ever, kind of thing. And I'm wondering two things. One is this development of the cantos, him beginning to basically set a treatise that says, if you don't know as much as I do, you're not really going to understand where I'm coming from, and I don't care, because I'm demonstrating, basically what an amazing person I am. And from the little I know about, I don't know a lot about Pound, but at one point in time, I did write a play about him in his later years, post World War II, and his dialogue with Erich Fromm. And it seems that beneath all this hubris, he was an extraordinarily insecure person, and always feeling that he was unrecognized for his abilities, and that his abilities were often by himself quite overblown from what everybody else thought about. And so I'm wondering about whether or not this compilation and jumping from here to there and there to here it's in some ways the instability of a mind who is desperately trying to demonstrate how much they know.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I think I think you could include that, but at the same time balance the experience most people have when you're writing, which is, something is taking you over in a way. Whether you want to call it the unconscious or a divine inspiration or just an instinct or an impulse. And, I don't know any poets who really try to show off in their writing. Maybe later they'll go back and try to show off the writing that they think is good. But when you're down to the, act of writing, and I think Pound was very insecure here. He knew people couldn't read this. And in a couple of cantos, we're going to see him, doing things like quoting Dante, "Hey, you in the little bark following me, are you still there?" It's like his readers, he thinks, are like people in these little dinghies, as he calls it, way back there. It's like, are you guys still there? Are you near me? Because he just, he knows that he's going out into places that very few people know what to do with. But it is, the materials of his mind. And I think the best way to approach this at the beginning is much more like a Kurt Schwitters and just say, these are the fragments, and he's trying to arrange them and put them together and see what is happening here, rather than saying this is a narrative and this is what he's trying to say and do, and a story to tell. So it's a mix of extraordinary hubris. The hubris is that he's kind of saying, I'm going to be like Homer and write the the epic for the new civilization, and I'm going to take 40 years to do it. And the other side is, I got to respond to my world going on here. This is like a really, really wrecked world, and I don't know what to do. I have all this stuff, and what to do with it all. Well, that might be a good place to, sort of wrap things up. And, having sort of looked at the first two cantos and seen, the kinds of materials that Pound was working with, the, what he thought his motives were. And, maybe one last, thing to say in terms of your comment, Carla, is that Pound really seems to later on get at his best when his world collapses. He's at his worst when he seems to know what he's doing with the cantos. He's at his best when he doesn't know what he's doing. And that's one of the things that I find makes the book exciting. And I think right here in these early cantos, he's trying to figure it out. He's trying, and all he can do is sort of move with this material. And it's not easy, as I said, it's not easy. If anybody is interested, it's not necessary, but there is a big thing called the Companion to the Cantos of Ezra Pound, that by a character named Carol Terrell, who's now dead, but he sort of looked up all the references he could, and you can go through and you can find out what Shoney refers to and who Tyro is, and what these different names, what that Liaeus is a name for Dionysus, and he sort of tells you what books Pound may be working with or what, references, and it's really helpful if you want to go really deep into this. On the other hand, I think you can also, sort of feel the poetics and, work, maybe not just on the surface, but, move along. And my job will just be to, whatever I've done, try to understand what's going on in these places.
Andrew,
That was
this has
really
been fit.
Yeah, I was just going to say that was really interesting, Andrew. Thank you. I'll have the book by Tuesday, so look forward to
If
that.
anybody wants to read ahead, great. But, if you find yourself really lost, hang on and we'll just move along. Good, Paul.
Andrew, I second that. This has been amazing, quite a ride. Very, very grateful to have you as a guide for this. I'm going to miss next week. I'm going to let Matt Treese be your screen sharer, and I hope there's no confusion with the Zoom link. But Matt will hopefully get an email out just before the class starts, and I'll try and be there at the beginning in case there are any problems. But extremely grateful for you and for this opportunity. Thank you. And this, if today is any judge, this is really going to be a remarkable experience. So thank you.
Good, and thank you, everybody, and for your questions and insights. And, please, let's make this very collaborative as we go forward. And I'll see you next week, Matt, then, and see everybody.
Andrew,
Yeah.
Sure.
Mhm.
there was a question in the chat about if you recommended a bio, which one would it be? Somebody said they thought about buying the Solitary Volcano, but
Yeah, and I that was me. I didn't buy it because I didn't like the way that it was written, but I am curious. But I was told by a friend who, I don't know if you know Mark Scroggins, Andrew, who, yeah, I mean, his long poem Zion Off Ramp is really built on the architecture of Pound, but he just recommended the link I put at the very beginning, which is the Ezra Pound Cantos.org online companion. And if you look under each Cantos, it has all these this is a different question than the biography, but you might be able to save yourself some money on the references going there. But yeah, the biography would be great if you ever
The one I like is a big book. It's by a guy named Humphrey Carpenter, and it's got a dumb title, A Serious Character. You eventually come to understand that it's not as bad a title as it sounds like. But what I like about Humphrey Carpenter is he's a real biographer, and he doesn't know or care very much about poetry. So you're spared endless pages of people trying to explain to you what Ezra Pound was really doing. He really is giving you the details of Pound's life and the drama of it. Some of the other ones I've tried to look at, like there's one by Pound's son-in-law, Noel Stock, which is like a sort of apologist for Ezra Pound. And there are various other ones that I think are a bit too much like explaining. So I like Humphrey Carpenter's, but it's a very big book. It's well researched and the story's pretty well told. There may be more details than you want, but I'd rather figure out on my own what the poem means and let the biographer tell me what's going on with the life.